Thank you. And thank you folks for joining us today. I'm going to turn off my video so it's not distracting, but this is Pat Wagner at Pattern Research in Denver, Colorado. And on behalf of the South Carolina State Library, we're going to be talking about a first in a series. And in this series on leadership, we're going to be talking today about precision in communication. Why don't people listen to me? And so this is where I turn this off. Thank you so much. And for those of you who don't know me, I've been a trainer and consultant for libraries in the United States and Canada since 1978. And I want to tell you that this particular topic, what we're going to be talking about today, is one of my favorite subjects. And I want to make sure that we all say praises to the Library Services Technology Act grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is administered by your state library. All of us should be grateful about what they do for us and for the library community. Now, every program I do has a key idea, and the key idea today is the English language is very slippery. And that's kind of at the heart of talking about precision and what this means. It means a kind of a thoughtfulness. Now, during the program today, watching it live, we're going to be monitoring questions. We will be taking questions at the end, but Tiffany knows if she sees something that she feels, yeah, it's worth interrupting Pat, she can do that. And that's fine with me. Fine with me. So when we talk about precision in language, you're going to hear me saying this over and over again for the next 90 minutes, by which I mean. So what I try to do in this program is to get us accustomed to adding precisions to everyday language we use when warranted. So what do we mean by precision in language? It means uses words that are concrete and specific. And when we say grounded, it's about physical evidence, what we see, what we hear, and what we touch. And so what we try to do is translate sometimes abstract uh, terms. And these are terms that everybody uses all the time. And as I like to say, it's not a problem until it is. It's not a problem to ask somebody to do something and know they're going to do it until they're a new employee and they haven't been around for 10 years and they don't know the culture of your library. Or you're new at a new place trying to tell people things to do, and you're kind of surprised because at your old workplace, there was no problem. At the new workplace, there seems to be lots of mistakes and under misunderstandings. So some people get very self-conscious about this idea of precision in language and say, do I have to do this in every situation with every person every time? And my thing is, no, of course not. However, if you would like to reduce the number of misunderstandings and mistakes in your library workplace and increase productivity, this is something to think about. And I need to tell you again, I think this is a foundation set of skills for great communication, and it builds on everything that we're going to be doing in the future in this series this year. So what it means is that we're going to be talking about concepts and descriptions, and we're not going to argue about labels or definitions. So if I say to you something like, I want you to respect me, we're not going to argue about the dictionary definition of what respect means. What I'm going to say is, this is what I mean by this. Now, during this program, we're going to have exercises. If you're watching this as a recording, it'll be easy to pause, and I would suggest consider having a group of people watch this together so you can talk about the exercises and the ideas. However, today we're hoping that you will use the chat box to share your feedback and comments and concerns as we go along, particularly when we get to what we like to call these mind exercises. So it's what the concept is and what the actual physical description is, instead of just relying all the time on a label and a simple definition. So there are four outcomes that we hope happen out of this. Part of it is reducing uncertainty, which means that you're going to put on your pause button and think about, what is it I'm going to say right now, if it's important, and how am I going to frame it in such a way that we're both on the same page, we understand each other, even if we disagree with each other. And by the way, I started learning to do this early in my marriage. My husband and I have been together 45 years, and I have to say, I am not a psychologist or a therapist, but knowing how to do this stuff does kind of leak over into your personal life. In addition, the more you do it, the easier it becomes, and it eventually, in my experience, becomes a habit that improves your communication with everyone, not just verbal communication, but written as well. To make sure that when you're working on projects that everyone has the same information and shares the same goals. What is it that we're trying to accomplish here? And again, it's not a problem until it is a problem. That you are able to evaluate success on a project. You know, one thing that clarity does when we're talking about precision is we are all held accountable. We're going to talk more about that in the goals that we set on projects. So they're not vague or ambiguous. And I have noticed, and maybe you have too, over the years, that sometimes people are hesitant to set specific goals because they don't want to be able to say, you know, we said we were going to do this and it didn't work out. And my feeling is that one of the ways to get people to trust you is to be specific, even if you know that, I don't know if we're going to succeed or not, but this is what we're trying to accomplish about things. People trust you more than that, than if you play a bad politician game of always being vague about what you're trying to accomplish. And then, and this is a big deal, um, I've been watching this all over the country now as more and more people are switching jobs, changing jobs within a library, new people coming in and job hunting, people outside the library community coming in to work at libraries for the first time. I was just talking to someone from our state library in Colorado earlier this morning, and they had an opening, and I think they had 26 applicants, many of which were from out of the state. And we were talking about there were a few months ago that this same position they might have gotten 5 applicants for. So a lot of places I'm noticing are having more turnover. I don't know if you're experienced that or not, but to be able to train people and get them understanding your culture and how things are done, and to be able to have them communicate better if they see things that they're questioning and so on, I think is really important. And that kind of weird feeling you have when you go to a workplace for the first time, and I've certainly experienced it, is one of the things we want is for new employees to feel competent and confident as quickly as possible in their job. And I believe precision and communication can reach that goal as well. So, the agenda, we're going to talk about translation. Can you describe words that we call labels like respect, teamwork, professional in such a way that other people can understand it? We're going to take us through kind of a case study, which I always love having to do with please clean the house. And this is one that I hope you have a little fun with if you share this with the folks in your library. Um, Something that's very important these days. We, for the last 20 years as a culture, have become more and more engaged in quantifying just about everything that happens in a workplace, putting a number to it. But what we're talking about today is not just numbers, but also descriptions, physical descriptions of things. We're going to talk kind of about the pros and cons of both approaches. I have some resources, by the way, at the end that I think you'll find useful. Then we're going to do some examples and stories. And I feel that in a project like this, what's really important is to give people as many examples as possible. So we're going to be doing a lot of concrete examples that are real to workplaces, real to library workplaces, and see if this makes sense to you or not. And then we're going to talk about planning, because one of the important places that precision and communication comes in is big strategic plan and operational plans, which are the day-to-day, how do we get things done? And I've been involved in a number of strategic planning initiatives, including in your beautiful state of South Carolina. And one place that sometimes I have, let's say, a conflict with the Board of Trustees or the leadership has to do with the fact that at the same time we want to use big words to describe big concepts and big ideas, we still need to translate those words into something concrete. So we're also going to talk about what it means to take some of the big ideas that might occur in a strategic plan and at the same time make it something something concrete so everybody knows what we're talking about. Everyone knows. And I think that's important. I don't know about you, but sometimes I have been in a room with a big thinker, someone who's charismatic and they have great ideas and they have all the keywords. We're going to do this and this and this, and we're cheering and we've got the cheerleader pom-poms and the balloons and the confetti guns and everything. And then that person leaves the room and I tell you within 5 minutes, I don't remember anything they said and I don't know what the heck they're talking about. So my approach to things is, yes, let's have those big words, but at the same time, we're going to say, but in this particular case, by which I mean this particular thing. Then we're going to talk about some assignments. I didn't know if you were told there was actually going to be homework, but yes, there is going to be homework. And what we'll be talking about are 4 or 5 things that we are going to suggest that you can do immediately when you return to your workplace as applications here. And then, because this is going to be part of a bigger project, which with the Niche Academy, we are also going to give you a preview of some of the modules that will be appearing over time in the Niche Academy um, application. And the two modules we're going to be talking about are two models of communication, the influence model and the positive reinforcement model. And they are models where we apply these ideas and such. So you're going to get a little introduction to that, and then a lot of resources and references, books and websites where you can kind of find ways to apply this information as well. So the first thing is, can you describe respect, teamwork, and professional? And a lot of these things are beautiful and they're abstract. But if you had an assignment in school where you would look at this lovely image of the daisy and the rocks, and they said, tell us what this means to you. How do you feel? It's very likely that 60 to 70% of the participants in your classroom would write basically the same thing. But 30% would probably say, oh, it's something very unlike what anyone else said. And just so we can get our math wrong, another 10%, which would be 110%, would say, I have no idea what you're talking about. This means nothing to me. So what we want to do is to see if we can make these things concrete. So what are we talking about? What is precision? And there's two main ideas where we can apply this idea of precision in communication. The first thing is quantitative measurements. We talk a lot about that right now. How much, how far, how many, how big, and so on. And we're going to be mentioning later the Library Research Services, which is here in Colorado. And they've been doing a splendid job of sharing information and ideas about the specifics of quantitative measurements. And you can go to their website, lrs.org, and we'll have it at the end again as a resource for this particular class. And they have a lot of free stuff for libraries to help you do surveys and polls and how to examine information and so on in great ways. Uh, and that's not what we'll be talking about much today. What we're going to be talking about is what we call qualitative descriptions. And sensory specific is a term from cognitive psychology, and it's what things actually look like, what things actually sound like, and human behavior. And so I tell people, I'm a big fan of pop television. I tell people that the reason we have 20 seasons of the original Law and Order is so that everyone in America would know what physical evidence was. And it's what's happening. It's what's happening. Now, a lot of people say, isn't this kind of wishy-washy? I mean, this isn't really, quote, scientific, is it, to talk about descriptions? Well, people who do economic development think it's valid, and I do too. And here's kind of a little mind exercise. If you were to take me around your part of your beautiful state in your car, we're driving around and we would come to a town, you would be able to tell me, well, this is a very prosperous community, Pat, because look out the window and what do you see? On the other hand, you might drive me through another part of your state and say, sadly, this is not a very prosperous community. look out your window and what do you see? Because I've had the opportunity and the honor, as it were, to visit libraries all through the United States, I have actually driven through every state in the lower 48, as well as visiting Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii. And so I have driven all the main highways, but I've driven a lot of state and county highways. And I have found it's pretty easy to drive through a community and to be able to see what's working and what's not. So just for fun, if I was driving through a community, what do you think you would see that would tell you, inform you is the word we use, that this was a prosperous community versus a not prosperous community? And if you have some ideas, feel free to put them in the chat box and share. And I will share with you what most of the audiences of library people around the country tell me when I ask them that question. And by the way, we could make it very specific. What would inform you that the library you were walking into and visiting was a quote, good library, a bad library, a successful library, not a successful library, just from what you would see, no statistics. So it's interesting. It doesn't matter if it's an urban community or small town or rural, people say the same things. You know the town's in trouble if you see a lot of boarded up storefronts. You know the town's in trouble if the infrastructure isn't being taken care of, if there's a lot of potholes, if the streets haven't been paved recently, if the curbs are broken. You know that people are having trouble if they don't have the disposable income to take care of their lawns and their houses and such. If, to be honest, most of the cars on the street are what we used to call junkers. On the other hand, if you drive through a town and it's busy and the streets are crowded, and they're not just crowded with one kind of person, but the people are on the street playing and doing family things and shopping, and it represents the ethnicity of the town you're in and all socioeconomic status. It's like going to a football game where you see everybody in town show up and be able to say, yeah, this is a place I like to see. Some of the economic development people say that they have the Thai restaurant. I love this, the Thai restaurant protocol, sort of meaning that a town that has at least one Thai restaurant is doing well. If it has two Thai restaurants, it's doing really, really well, right? Lawns are kept up. In our part of Denver, a neighborhood called West Washington Park, we're kind of into competitive gardening. So you drive through our neighborhood in the summertime and the trees look good and the gardens look good. Even in the smaller, more, let's say, modest homes, people have flowers. We're definitely a dog community. In fact, I don't know how my husband and I have gotten away with living here as many years without at least two dogs. I sit in our living room as I work looking out our front window and all the dog walkers, it's kind of fun. So that kind of description for somebody who is an economic development person is just as valid as the measurements and might even tell you something different. Now, there's another part of it which is really important, which is no mind reading of intentions, by which I mean that all we are talking about is what we see and hear, not what we're guessing are the meanings that people might have, the subtext. And that I found was one of the hardest things to do in learning about precision, not constantly saying, well, I know what they really mean. Now, of course, we're hit by all this information, but I'll give you a hint that professional communicators use. And I've been trained as a facilitator and someone who deals in conflict management and so on. When in doubt, why not ask them? Duh. Rather than guess and be misinformed all the time. And yes, people will misspeak. People sometimes say, I don't know, and that's fine. But if you can practice the not mind reading rule, you'll find that you actually become a better communicator with people. So what are the benefits? All right, I already mentioned it's better at holding us all accountable, challenging stereotypes. So if someone makes a big, broad statement, like I'm from Chicago, I love the Chicago Cubs. And if someone said, well, all Chicago Cubs fans are idiots, I might say, well, have you actually met all Chicago Cubs fans? Because most of the members of my family I would not call idiots or whatever. And if you ask questions in a friendly, interested way, not to gaslight them or anything else, but in a friendly, interested way, you often can find out what they really mean and also challenge them on some of the stereotypes they might have about a particular group of people. Grounds conversation. So I'm the kind of person that I love talking about abstract big ideas, but at some point, if we're talking about day-to-day life in our workplace, we need to be somewhat specific. We start by assuming people might understand, particularly with a complicated project, what the pieces are if we're not specific. So really does help to stop misunderstandings. Not everything, but stop a lot of the noise. Proves accuracy. And then we don't have to have arguments about a definition. So if someone, for example, says, well, Pat, I don't think you're good at teamwork. And I say, yes, I am. This is my definition of teamwork. And the other person says, well, this is my definition of teamwork. And then we spend 2 hours arguing what the definition is. And people actually pull out dictionaries and go to websites and say, this is the definition of that. We don't have to do that anymore. What we only say is that the concept I'm talking about is this. And if you want to call it teamwork, great. If you want to call it bananas, that's fine with me. Let's talk about the concept and the specifics. It really can help. But as anything in the world, there's a downside. Too much of anything is not good. First of all, for some of us, it takes practice. I'll be upfront. When I was first learning this, for it to become easy for me to do, took me 2 years. 2 years. It took me 3 to 6 months where I was aware enough to stop what I was saying and doing to fix it. It took 2 years to become as much of a habit. And I really was conscientious about it. It really was important to me that it became more of a habit. And I got a lot of feedback over the years from people who say, wow, you're so clear on your communication. And, I'm an independent contractor. It's bought me some contracts where people said, you won the contract because you were so clear in what you wrote and spoke in the interview. So there's a benefit to that, but it takes practice. And I'm kind of a, hit ready aim person myself. And so this taught me patience. I had to put that pause button on and really think about what I was going to speak. As it became a better habit, it was something that became unconscious in most situations, but still, um, I talk too much. I write too much. I know that. And I know with other people that when I'm trying to be clear about something, I can sound tedious. I can sound pedantic about stuff. Just too much information. So that's something anyone who does this has to be aware of. I sometimes, when I use this language, I'm so focused on the details that I lose the big picture about what's going on and don't look up from my work to say, oh, but there's a bigger goal here than just the details I'm talking about today. It can, and boy, this is a big one, it can sound condescending. There will be people who in your workplace, you don't communicate with them very well and vice versa. So you're trying to use more precision in language. Their response is to be defensive and angry because they're like, I already know this. Why are you telling me 3 times? And you're thinking, because the last time we did this project, you ignored all the instructions and such. It may not be precision in language is going to help the situation, but that condescending thing, that's an issue you have to talk about. And this is a big one. It can seem like you're micromanaging people. And we're going to talk more about this, that your attention to detail is removing their ability to creatively create solutions that work. So these are some of the things we have to think about kind of as a counter to this as well. So this is the challenge that we have, is that words are labels. So if I say I had a wonderful time, you might say, oh, a wonderful time. If you said a wonderful weekend, for example, oh, a wonderful weekend meant that you went mountain climbing. A wonderful weekend meant that you were at parties all weekend. You went to your favorite bar and everything. When I say wonderful, I mean, oh, it was great because I got to sit at home all weekend and read and maybe make dinner for my husband. And that's my idea of wonderful. So everything we bring to a situation, we have all of that backstory. And if you've worked with a group of people for a long time, you have the same backstory, the same context in what you do, and you don't notice it again until there's new people in the room who have no idea what you're talking about. And even if people do share your worldview, they may have different interpretations. Like just for fun, and you can raise your virtual hand if you want. How many of you think that you probably had a significant misunderstanding with someone you've lived with for a long time, like a family member, say in the last month? I would say that my husband and I, who not only live together but work together, probably have a miscommunication at least once a day, if not more. And we're trained in this stuff as well. So that whole thing about words is that if it's really important, we want to be precise. If it's really important, we want to be precise. So these are some cloud words that we all have to deal with. When we say cloud words, and this is a phrase I borrowed from my husband, we're talking about waffle words that can mean 100 different things. Abstract words or ideas or things from scholarly fields that sometimes are just really pompous. And you want to say, well, don't you mean this simple idea? Ambiguous meanings, big picture words, jargon, and this is something we really have to watch out with civilians who come to the library. It's so easy to slip into jargon, and I'm going to share some of my favorite jargon words I've learned from working with you folks for many years, and then cliches that have lost meaning. And they're kind of a placeholder word. I feel sometimes we use some cliches because we don't have anything better to say. Sometimes they're just fine, but sometimes it's like, well, what do you mean in this context? Because I'm confused. So here's an exercise that we give people when we're doing this program together, face to face. These are example of words that I bet you and I might have different definitions of, different descriptions of. Um, Simply because we rely on the fact that, oh, you know what I mean when I say appropriate. Like if I say we have a dress code here at our library and it says dress appropriately. Well, you should know what you mean. Any sensible person with experience in a workplace should know what I mean. I should not have to explain appropriate. Well, I was working with an academic library with a very fine university, and they had hired a cataloger from a very fine library school, and she had come in, and she was a disaster for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons had to have happen with the dress code. She had come from a very informal university on the West Coast, and this was a very formal university on the East Coast where the library staff dressed up every day. Somehow she didn't notice it or she didn't think it applied to her because she was in the back room as a cataloger, but she would come in sweats every single day. And on the little checklist of reasons that they were going to terminate her contract or not renew it, they had dressing appropriately. And I said, have you ever told her what appropriate dress is? Do you actually have some guidelines for people? Oh, we've never needed it because everyone understands. And I said, well, it wasn't a problem until it's a problem. And you spent 2 years being upset with this woman and actually never said something? Well, she ought have noticed. And I said, yes, she ought have noticed, but your job is not to set her up for failure as well. And it turned out that she just thought that applied to the front people. She thought it was an option. She thought it was an option because there were no specifics. Well, we made the guidelines for that kind of thing a little bit more specific just so people had an idea, and then said we can talk about these things as well. Well, this was a sad story in the sense that she had damaged her relationship, the whole situation. It wasn't just about how she dressed, but there were other things as well. Damaged the relationship. Her contract wasn't renewed. But the nice thing is that they gave her a glowing review on her technical and professional skills, which was great. And she ended up at a large public library where she did just fine for her career because it was the kind of place that the back room could come dressed in blue jeans and nobody cared. Nobody cared. But these are the kind of words that get people in trouble. And when I come in as a contractor asked to do a webinar or training program, they said, Pat, we want you to talk about user experience. And I say, by which you mean? We want this to be a welcoming library. You tell our staff that we want it to be a welcoming library. And I say, by which you mean? um, we're going to talk about phonological awareness in a minute. That's my absolute favorite phrase I've ever found in a library. But I have been in excellent, excellent libraries. I mean, places with, smart people, great customer service. And they asked me to do a program at this particular library in employee engagement. They said, we're doing employee engagement, Pat, and we want to know your views on it. And I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. Could you please give me some concrete examples? It took 45 minutes with the committee for them to finally tell me that for them, employee engagement meant that people who they were asking to do their jobs weren't doing the jobs they were hired to do, and they didn't know how to get people to do the job that they were hired to do. And that's what they meant by employee engagement. When we got to the bottom line, you may have a different description of what you mean by employee engagement, but people like me will dig around like you would do in a good reference interview to find out what people actually mean by those phrases. So we did an experiment for a few years, and this came out of work I did not just with the library community, but also with federal agencies, where we asked audiences of all kinds to sit at tables, and there was like 4 to 6 people at a table, and write down and talk about what you meant by the word respect. And remember, a few minutes ago, I said that probably 60% of the people might agree on a meaning for that flower in the brickwork. Well, that comes out of this work that we did with probably 2 or 3 dozen workplaces, that at those tables, about 60% of the time, people would agree with everybody else in the room. But 40% of the time, people would come up with something totally different, or they would come up with, they wouldn't know. They just wouldn't know how to describe it. So here's examples, and I'm just going to cover a couple of them right now. Um, if I want, when I say that I want you to respect me, what I mean is I want to be invited to budget meetings at least once a month. I want you to allow me to finish my sentences and not interrupt me. I want to be included in decision making that affects my job. I want you to address me by my name instead of, hey, you. I want to be asked to stay late, not told. I assume when you ask me, it means that you're able to offer overtime, which is great, but I still want to be asked. I want the rules to apply to everyone equally. I don't want exceptions for people who are higher up in the food chain, or people who think they're important, or intimidating members of the community because they have money or status or have lived here before the Revolutionary War. I want you to be quiet when I'm talking in team meetings. I don't want you on your phone. I don't want you having side chats with people. Pay attention to me. I want you to criticize me in private, and I want to be given difficult projects with more responsibility. That's what those people mean when they say the word respect. So if someone says to you, I want you to respect me more, a good response is specifically, what do you mean? And if they respond with, well, you should know, any person with a brain in their head should know what I mean by the word respect, say, well, nonetheless, that's my favorite adverb. Nonetheless, could you give me specifics? If you give me a specific, I would be more likely to understand what the problem is, and then we can talk about that problem. But then the problem is when precise language can become micromanagement. Micromanagement. Micromanagement, by the way, is when we pay too much attention to the how people do things rather than the goals. So let's talk a little bit about this case study about please clean the house. Please clean the house. And the reason I pick something that isn't directly library related is sometimes it's easier for us to understand a concept from personal home experience and then translate it to a workplace as well. But we've had all kinds of versions of this when you ask somebody to do something like clean the break room, right? Or reorganize the files, or let's basically make it so that we can find the information we want um, back in tech services. Whatever it is, we have our own version of clean the house. So here we go. If you needed to ask your family, the people you live with, to clean your home, which might be a condo, an apartment, a duplex, a house, a rental, something you own, trailer, doesn't matter, and you got the word during the day that there was going to be people showing up for dinner that you weren't expected, what would be the top item on your list? And would those other people you live with or who would be responsible for cleaning agree with that? And we find that when we ask people this question as a group, people have a version of answers. I'm going to show you in a minute what the typical answers we hear from people are in the group. So feel free to contribute. If you and I were living together and you had to call me and I was at home and say, Pat, people are coming over, please clean the house. What would be the first item on your list? Because we often run out of time and resources. That's one of the reasons we do this. And would other people agree? When I did this out of personal experience with my husband, we live in a little 1903 bungalow in the center of Denver. My things to do to clean the house, and I'm terrible at cleaning the house, is I use the rheostat to dim the bulbs in the living room and dining room, and I move all the clutter into my office, and I light scented candles. That's my theory of cleaning the house. My husband's theory that even if people are walking up the front walk, he'll be wiping down our nice hardwood floors. And that's my husband's first thing. What do I hear from people? Well, please help. Here's the scenario. Please help clean our home for the dinner party for your sister and her new partner, by which I mean, and so let's see what most of your colleagues have told me over the years. Disinfect the bathroom, clean the bathroom first, or clean out the kitty litter pan first, or vacuum the carpets first, or plump the nice pillows as a great distraction. Some people I know say, no, I tell people put out the drinks and snacks so people can be sitting and chatting while I finish cleaning. Hide the debris from home deliveries. We now have a bin for all the extra cardboard and everything that we collect during a month of home deliveries so that before we can get it to the recycling bin. Clean the kitchen, throw things in the dishwasher, and in honor of my husband, wipe down the hardwood floors. Could you understand how two people who otherwise love each other and trust each other can get really upset if they come home and they expect someone to have disinfected the bathroom and there they are in the kitchen arranging snacks instead? I think 50% of divorces are based on these scenarios here. So, what are all those ways that I could misunderstand the request to clean the house? Well, some of them are just priorities. Some of them is no matter how long I've lived with that person, I think I have a better idea of how to do it. I have a better idea and we should do my idea instead. That often happens in families and relationships as well. So, going back to this idea of quantifiable, does everything again have to be numbers? And what is the balance between numbers and descriptions? One of the sources of resources I gathered for you are things having to do with storytelling and infographics. I think infographics in our age is a wonderful, how would you say, connection between quantifiable and um, qualitative information, between what things look like and sound like versus counting things. So I've given you a whole bunch of examples of free and inexpensive resources for that at the end of this particular webinar. But let's take a look at what that means. So again, we have to look at the pros and cons. If we are going to use numbers, it can create consistency because we're all talking about how many books were checked out, how long popular books were circulated for, how much money came in from donations, how many people actually visited the library. We do those samplings of usage figures, how many of the graphic novels were checked out versus contemporary literature versus what we might call classic literature. We can analyze data because we're looking at numbers, and it's easier to transfer the data to person A to person B because you're looking at the same numbers, right? Uh, Numbers tend to have less emotion than words. That's something we know on our planet. And it is easier, not necessarily, and this is my bias, more effective to set goals based on um, numbers. It's easier to set goals, but not necessarily the right things. So you can say, this is how many people signed up, or this is how many library cards that are active based on this particular criteria, but it doesn't tell us other stuff, which we're going to cover in a minute. And if you have people in leadership positions inside and outside the library who are political and financial decision makers, it tends to satisfy those people better if they have a figure, right, where they can say to the general public, this is the number. And somehow that satisfies people. But the downside is that it's only limited to what we decide to ask for, right? It's like, well, we never thought to ask for that and it's not there. I was just talking about this morning with someone talking about a job hunting situation they were involved in their public library where they were looking at resumes, and one of the things the person who's on the committee to vet the resume said, we keep looking at things where they look good on paper, but when they come into interview, it's like they're two different people. It's like, and it's not that they're lying, but what we inferred from their resume is very different from how they talked to us and communicated. Like they said they were a great communicator on paper. We didn't experience that in the interview. We lose details. This is something my husband, who's trained as an economist, drives him crazy, that we come up with a gross number, or even if the number is defined, we lose a lot of the nuance of who actually was coming in and how they felt about the library and how they actually interacted. It's the difference between what people say and what people actually do. And things that are not middle of the road, people who are the exceptions, who may predict future trends, who may be underserved audiences, or people who feel like they have been rejected or so on, they won't fall into the parameters we've set with those numbers. So, in effect, sometimes people tend to disappear. They tend to disappear. And as Alfred Korzybski, who was the Polish engineer who sort of invented the field of general semantic theory and was one of the people who really wanted us to pay attention to these things, said, the map is not the territory. And any of you who've ever gone hiking on, off of a map or used a map to try to get directions, say, the map says one thing, but when you really get down to the details, it ends up being something different. Regardless of how good you are with your numbers, I want you to understand that every project has overhead. And sometimes people say, Pat, we have a large library district. We can't go over all the time to check. And I'm not saying all the time, but when was the last time you visited that building or that department or that project? You're getting in the reports on paper, but have you ever actually gone and kicked the tires yourself to see what's happening there? So here are some things I've learned over the years, and some of this is from hard won personal failure of when I didn't check in on things personally and just relied on reports people gave me. And some was from investigators. People were actually private investigators about how they look for wrongdoing of different kinds. Um, Visiting in person unannounced, which some people will feel like is spying. But when was the last time you dropped in on Circ in a weekend and found out the circulation staff was making up their own rules because there was no one there to oversee them? If you go into a place and they don't know you're the boss, how are you treated if they think you're a customer? I was a college instructor, just adjunct college instructor at a community university college here in Colorado, State University. And when I went to sign up, I was in my usual summer attire of blue jeans and a t-shirt. And I went into the department where I was supposed to be registered as adjunct for the coming semester. and the lady behind the counter was pretty rude to me. And she said, "Well, you're a student, blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry for the mistake. I'm actually not a student. I'm one of the faculty." And the woman actually said to me, "Oh, Pat, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wagner. I was rude to you." She actually said, "I was only rude to you because I thought you were a student." So I went and visited about a half a dozen departments, presented myself as a student, and watched how their behavior changed toward me when they found out that actually I was an instructor. And I've had that experience in other situations as well. Sometimes we only know how people are going to experience something when there's someone, let's say, important. What are people going to tell you in a casual conversation rather than in a formal interview? We have to keep asking ourselves what's missing, what's missing, what's missing. I have actually, this is sort of sad, but I've actually been at conferences, library conferences, where the discussion was how can we attract more teenagers to programs we're doing? And there were no teenagers in the room to talk about their experiences of why they didn't come to programming. You know, like who's missing? And then for people like myself who are consultants, I am not smarter or better informed than anyone. You know what? What I give to a library client is simply fresh eyes and fresh ears. I'm seeing and hearing something for the first time, which is why all of you would make superb consultants, because you'd walk into a library as a visitor and you would see and hear things from a librarian point of view that the people there might have just gotten accustomed to over the years. So here are some examples. I think examples are really, really important. And again, it's the by which I mean examples and stories. And what we have to understand in precision communication, it's not just standing on our mountaintop, um, pouring our wisdom down to people. It always also has to do with this idea of a dialogue, not a monologue. And by the way, that's one of the secrets for keeping conversations, not to be micromanaging, but to work together on standards and information. And we're going to, again, go through some examples. And I love to say precision is a team sport. So, with the example of myself and my husband, over the years, we have taken apart, deconstructed, redefined, redescribed words. So, when we do use a label, we know what that label means, by which we mean. So the first thing, and I'm really getting down to the basics of what happens. And some libraries have guidelines for this kind of thing. And by the way, I am not into micromanagement at all. I'm not through thick layers of bureaucracy. However, I think it's reasonable that a team of people would come up with some, these are the standards that we think are important. And it's something then you can again hand that new employee so that that new employee kind of gets the picture. And yes, I've worked in libraries that say, well, we hire people who are already experienced. They should hit the ground running. We shouldn't have to have orientation or training. Well, that works very well on Vulcan, or it works where everybody works for a franchise. So the McDonald's franchise in this town looks exactly like the McDonald's franchise in another town, and you all have the same book, but that's not what happens in library land. So I picked something, the trustee meeting is going to be happening at the library, and you've had a lot of events the last month. So we want to make the library presentable, by which we mean uh, make sure the bathrooms smell fresh. We've been here for a month and we've gotten used to the smell of the bathrooms. New people coming in might not. Let's get the outside glass doors and the windows washed. We don't do it very often. And boy, it really, it's something we don't notice when it's dirty, but we do notice when it's clean. We need to replace the carpet squares, dust the sills, um, use matching chairs from storage, right? So again, these are everyday things. And if you and I worked together for a long time, we would figure these out. But if I was new working for you, I might not get that these are the things by which we mean in this workplace presentable. New employee orientation. So I'm sitting there half asleep and I'm in the auditorium. And I've worked with libraries that, whoa, in a year, they've had sudden growth because of a windfall of money or whatever. 130 new employees in a year. I'm not making this up for a large library district. And they hear the director say, we value initiative and teamwork. And what the heck does that mean? Well, in that mean, it might mean prepare a report on your project to read at each meeting that the expectation will be this is something you'll do. If you work here, yes, you're going to be expected to volunteer for association work. By the way, we will pay you for your time, but yes, we expect you to work as a volunteer at our state conference and to serve on various committees. You're supposed to check in. If you're going to do a vacation, it might been approved by HR and the administration, but have you checked in with your coworkers about your schedule so they know it because you're all working on projects that are going to impact each other? Uh, we expect you to take the initiative, meaning looking for ways we can save time and money, constant job improvement and ask for feedback. That's part of teamwork, saying, how did I do? Should I do this differently or better? And I had an employee who was shocked at the fact that it was accepted that people could criticize each other. And we asked her, how would you prefer being criticized? She said, I never want to be criticized. And I said, we all make mistakes. We all disagree. So what we're saying here, how do we make it as comfortable as possible? And, I have to say she never quite got it. She got more comfortable or she gave lip service to it, but she had not had good work experiences before. And she didn't believe this was like an okay thing for people to criticize her. I entered this award winning library, and here was the sign outside the children's area. Our parenting classes promote phonological awareness. Well, I'm a college graduate. I went to proud George Nelson Tremper High School in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I had to look up phonological awareness to understand what it meant. I hope you don't use words like this, particularly with your civilians, with your customers. What did it translate into? Learn word. Hey, if you come here, we'll teach you word games to play with your kids. And we have sing along stuff, which is really fun with babies and toddlers. And oh boy, if you're looking at fun stuff, engage people, talk to our children's librarians. They have all these fun ideas for fun picture books. One of the cool things is we want all of our kids to do great. And if you're looking for ideas to better prepare your kids so when they enter school formally, they're ready to read, they're ready to excel. We have ideas for that. And the cool thing is play works with kids. So there's all sorts of fun things again. That's what it means by phonological awareness. But, I know more than one person who is turned off by the jargon. So this is marketing. Beware of library jargon in marketing. Customer service is our core value. I am still doing many basic customer service training programs for libraries, partly because of all the new people coming in who've never worked at a library before. But that's not enough to say it's our core value. Personally, I would have to ask a lot of questions. We have standards for how we treat everyone, by which we mean everyone. We say hello, please, thank you, and goodbye. We walk customers to their destination instead of like pointing over our shoulder. If we have to say no, we talk about how we could have made it a yes. And we have to understand our policies are here for the convenience of the customer who comes in, not necessarily the staff. So we start talking about what would be the physical evidence for customer service. This is where dialogue is so important, not just the platitude, customer service is our core value. How about the reference department? We want to be useful to the business community. This is our goal in coming years. Well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is we want everyone who works here to take their turns being a representative of the library at Chamber of Commerce meetings so that we can mix and greet all the people in the business community in our community and find out what they need and talk to them. Maybe even we'll have a booth there to introduce them to some of the resources. We'll interview focus groups of businesses to find out what they want and what they need rather than us assuming. We'll invite people who are successful in the business community to make presentations. If they're known to be successful, there's a good chance that other business people will come to the library to hear them talk about what their successes were about, and so on. Make sure that we're inviting business groups to hold meetings at the library if it's possible, so that again, we can use it as an opportunity to show them what the library can do for them. And keep active on LinkedIn, which is really much better than Tumblr or Twitter to inform the business community and any other kind of business social media, special groups and things like that. Employee evaluations. You need to be more professional. When we do this live, I ask people to raise their hands. How many times have you been in a room and you've been told to be more professional and you have absolutely no idea what they're asking you? Right. Again, you ought to know. Anyone ought to know. I should tell you up front what my definition of professional is, and it is not about someone's experience or credentials or their degree. For me to say someone is professional, I say it's two parts. First, no matter how they feel that day, they show up and do a good job. And if they can't do a good job, they stay home and don't kind of impact everyone else with their bad mood. And the other thing is that you can work next to someone for 20 years and not like them, and they never know it, and none of the people you work with know it either. And when that person does leave the library, they come up to you and say, I'm a better person for having worked with you. How about that for a standard for professional? So yes, when I'm reviewing evaluation, forms that people have to do, and I realize some of these are mandated by your agencies and organizations, and you have to do what the city or the county tells you. I get that. Nonetheless, what does it mean? You need to be more professional. Stay calm and courteous, regardless of how you feel. I did an informal study in the state of Iowa a few years ago, and I asked people there who are all managers and middle managers of libraries and other state agencies what they thought was the best example of good management, supervision, and management. And they all said, almost to a person, good managers are calm in crisis. Good managers are kind of they're there. Let's take a breath. Let's let good stuff. And regardless of the situation, they were always civil to people going on in a way that maybe I couldn't feel civil, but they modeled this great behavior and it stuck with me. And I think that's something that's part of what might be your description of someone who is professional. Refrain from gossiping. Really think about the fact you're there not to compete with other people and show that you're better than them, but how do you elicit the best from others, even and particularly people who you might not like personally? Treat everyone with the same civility. I don't care how old they are. I don't care what their background or education is. I don't care their socioeconomic status. Nothing. I don't even care about their behavior. Everyone is treated with the same civility. Good morning and please and thank you. And I have been complimented in the past about the wonderful civility of people who I hire. People say, wow, Pat, you have such great employees. It just shows what a good trainer you are. And I go, I hire for manners. I hire for emotional maturity. I hire for them. Let them have learned that on someone else's dime in life, so I can take advantage of that in my workplace as well. And professional means volunteer to take responsibility. Some of you might have heard that it sometimes snows in Colorado. Ha ha ha. And we just had our record snowfall this last weekend. Took me 6 passes to shovel our corner lot. It's not my fault it it snows in Colorado. It's not my fault. However, it wasn't like I was kidnapped in the middle of the night, drugged, and woke up one day years later and said, "Oh my goodness, I'm living in a place that snows." No, I have responsibility. And it's not just the legal responsibility, but also an ethical responsibility to basically take care of our corner of our neighborhood as well. So for me, professional is the person who will say either, my bad, I'll fix it cheerfully, or will say, oh, you know what? I can take care of that. And they just volunteer. So that may be on your list of things. And it would be very interesting what the conversation might be. And you've already probably had this of what do we mean by that label, professional. So when we talk about strategic plans and operational plans, particularly strategic plans, this is where people kind of get very abstract and big picture. And what are we going to carve over the door on the side of the library to state it? And boy, aren't we constantly overwhelmed in maybe a good way on social media of people posting mottos and um, quotations and all these sort of feel good things. And isn't this great? However, I would suggest don't look into them too completely because when you do, you find out most of them are kind of meaningless, but they sound good, right? We should have things that make us feel good. That's a good thing. This is something I strongly believe in, that if you use precise language about what you're actually trying to accomplish, what would be the evidence, it's much more likely to be executed. And this is kind of my gold standard. If you've ever visited the city of Denver, you will notice that there's kind of this river that runs through the downtown, and that's the Platte River. And it's wide and it's wide and it's flat. It's in some cases literally just a few inches deep. It's not like a big fancy river, except in flood time. And when I first moved here in 75, oh, people were throwing old refrigerators and cars and mattresses, and it was horrible. And this one man wanted to clean it up. And what he did was brilliant. He created a table book, like one of those fancy coffee table books called the Greenway Foundation. And in it, he hired an artist to paint what could be. And the man that they hired painted beautiful, beautiful pieces of art about what the river could look like flowing through with all the parks and recreation and so on. Well, it happened. It happened in part because of that book. And I remember when a former mayor was cutting the ribbon on the final one of the river parks, and all I could think of was, oh my goodness, it looks just like the photo. It's like the photo. So his book was the by which I mean that explained the big picture ideas that were part of their decades long strategic plan. And again, an operations plan, when you're talking about painting the front door or reinstalling fire alarms or washing down the floors or disinfecting a room, for example, which is something we're all paying attention to, that's easier to do than when we talk about big strategic plans. But I feel that one of the reasons that strategic planning can fail or not live up to its promise is because of the language we use. And I think that, and again, I'm biased, but I think that some of the people who I do strategic planning for are actually delighted, like, oh my goodness, I could show this to an 11-year-old and they understand what we're about. Again, trust and respect. Transparency breeds trust. So, strategic planning in brief, this is not a class on strategic planning, is about that idea of the new destination. So, first of all, where are we going that's different and why? I like it to stretch our limits. I like to have plans that are big. It's something that we do in our little business about what we want for ourselves, what we want for our customers, and so on. Oftentimes, and we see this happening right now because of the pandemic, most of the libraries I know, not once or twice, but maybe more, have been redoing their strategic plans. I just read something people were saying, remember when we thought this was going to be a couple of weeks back in February and March? And I watched as every single one of my customers from last year finally over time canceled every single thing I was to do in person, moved everything online. And now the priorities are different, right? Maybe it's because we've realized or decided we have the resources to help some folks who are marginalized, underserved, people who deserve more of our attention and money. Maybe we've come up with some new ways, service models of how we can serve people. And certainly that applies to every library in the world, thinking about how we can do distant work, even when things come back that we have less restrictions that most of us have lived under. What will we stop doing? to make room for the new, and that's always a tough one. And then we have new ways of evaluating success. So we need precision language to be able to create goals that everyone says, I know what we're trying to achieve. I know what we kind of achieve. I might be able to quantify it, but I certainly can describe it. And I think that's the important part. So what I did was I took some big picture ideas that I've seen and probably you've seen in strategic plans for libraries, and then translated them. And some of these come from real word, excuse me, um, examples from strategic plan that I've worked with, people's strategic plans that I've read, things I've talked about in directors, and then there's a couple I kind of threw in as good ideas, but these are things that we've heard of. So there's a couple on this page I want to mention. I'm going to start at the bottom. What if, for example, we say we support educational achievement, by which we mean 100% adult literacy is a goal for our county, and we've decided it begins with reading readiness programs such as books and baby events in our library. By which we mean 100% adult literacy. I won't mention which state, but I have visited states where the library people have told me that in their local region, the illiteracy rates for native born adults, people who are born in English speaking families, is 30%. That's the illiteracy rate. So, what if you made 100% adult literacy goals as part of it? That our high school graduates will be sought after by the best employers and best secondary trade schools and colleges. I've had some friends who've gone to very fine prep schools, and they said one of the benefits is you actually get courted by the best schools in the country. And part of it is the reputation of the group. Well, wouldn't that be wonderful if that was about your public schools as well, not just the private schools? And when we say we're going to partner with the school district, we're going to say we're going to increase our knowledge of successful innovations in education and apply those ideas in programming and services to library. And that's all at the upper reaches of the strategic plan. And I don't care if you call things missions or visions or principles or values. This is what we mean when we talk about educational achievement. Here's another example. We say we offer services to everybody, and we're talking about, you know, equity and the difference between equality and equity and diversity, right? Inclusiveness. So here's some things that have come out of places, and some of these have come out of strategic plans I worked on years ago, years ago. Any service we offer will have an online version. This became part of the strategic plan for the city and county of Denver, where I live, a number of years ago. And part of the result is that customer service for working with our city when I'm a business owner and a homeowner is so simple because there's so much stuff I can do online. But the truth is, it's not everything is online all the time. And it doesn't mean that if you don't have a computer, you can't get services. We will recruit staff who are bilingual and who look like all the residents of our community. You know, that's going to be part of our staffing, that we're going to pay attention to that. We're going to look at all the barriers that keep people from using the library. And it could be a simple thing like repaving the parking lot, creating little libraries across the city. It's funny for me, in some communities, library folks are very much against the little libraries, and other places they embrace them and make them part of the libraries and what they're doing. We're going to improve anything that's at home and institutional services. One of the library systems I worked with in California a few years ago cobbled together some money and made it that anyone could get home deliveries and they didn't have to get a note from their doctor, which I find very invasive, to say that there was a medical need that they weren't able to come to the library. You wanted a book, we'd get it to you one way or another. And we will always be partnering and collaborating. Partner, collaborate, collaborate, and that will be of value for us as well. How would you, and this is an exercise to consider, how would you translate the mission and vision of your library strategic plan using concrete examples? Now, you may be one of the lucky folks who feels that what you have in your strategic plan is something you could hand to that 11-year-old. and that with the big ideas you have by which we means. And notice those are still big ideas. Let me go back here for a second. That when we say we offer services to everyone, that's still a big idea. To say we offer every service as an online version, that's still a big idea. By the way, a couple of these I've taken from what was the strategic plan for our state library in Colorado for many years. That Nancy Bolt, who was our state librarian for I think 20 years, a few decades ago, and a leader nationally in the library community, set with the library community 2 or 3 specific goals. She said, any service we offer will have an online version, by which we mean and that any citizen of Colorado who has a computer at home can access any collection, can do anything they want to do. So it wasn't just the individual libraries, it was every library. Also, she said, everything that we do as a state, we do multi-type. So we represent ourselves as the library community, which is inclusive to the school library, the academic library, the special library, and the public libraries. So we work together and we have representation about that. And that's how we present ourselves politically as well. At one point, she was approached many years ago, and this is public information, I'm not telling tales out of school, where she was approached by the state legislature. They said, Nancy, you're asking for library money for libraries, and you're including school and public libraries. If you would just let us um, give you money for the public schools, and then we'll deal with the school libraries another year. And Nancy refused. She said, you either fund everybody or you fund nobody. Well, some people heard about that and they were angry at Nancy, but she stood her ground. Everybody got funded together because she saw the need for the library community to communicate with each other. So we have a very, very high level of collaboration. And part of that was the goal we all knew about what needed to be done. Now, operational planning, it's a little simpler. It's like what we're fixing, right? You know this stuff. It's like, here's what we need to do. And I tell people in our little house, the difference between strategic planning and operational planning is we got a beautiful new front door on our old house this year. I love it. I love it. So I'm really happy about that. That's still operational planning, replacing the front door. If we're talking about if we're going to actually tear down our house and build a bigger house, that's strategic. If we're planning to sell the house to developers to create triplexes and we're going to move someplace else, that's strategic. That's strategic. So I'd like to present some of the assignments that we think that we would like you to consider. Things that um, and I'm going to kind of talk you through all of them, and I'm also going to talk you through all of the resources that we have as well. But let's start with the assignments. That these assignments are things that we think you could actually do. We could actually do. So let's take a look at them. First of all, and I'd love to hear from you in chat about this. I believe that we have to do at least once every 2 years an audit of our library's policies, and I call it a legal audit. And the reason for this is that oftentimes we put things in place at the local level, which I mean at the municipal county level, at a library, not realizing that state or federal law has changed. And then we have it on the books for a while, and then there's a problem. And I actually was in a room where the county attorney, who was reviewing some problems because there was a threatened lawsuit against the library, and he was looking at some of the policies. He looked at me and he looked at the director, and there was some trustees in the room. I was there as just a facilitator. And he said, oh, please, God, tell me that this isn't your rules because they are so much in violation of a state personnel law, that we might just as well hand this person a check because you are in violation of state personnel law the way you have written this. And nobody caught it. Not everyone's a personnel attorney. They might be a very good attorney for some things. Not every HR person is up to speed on everything going on. I mean, they're probably a good person, but that doesn't mean they know everything going on. That's just how it is. So maybe some of you have already done this, but what I find very useful is to be able to sit down with your actual library customers and coworkers and go through and see what jargon and what kind of waffle words and such are in library policies, and see if it's reasonable to replace them with something that's precise. And again, I learned this in the business world. The 11-year-old test is great because 11-year-olds are smart. They may not have all the experience, but they should be able to figure out what you're talking about. And it may have mean that a word has two meanings. Now, this wouldn't apply to you, but I think it was very funny. One of my mentors, a woman named Laura, is a consultant and trainer who works all over the world. And she was very famous in the United States in certain fields a few years ago. And she got a chance to present in Australia. Now, the word commit has a lot of different language meanings in the English language. And she wrote up a report that talks about, I think it's important for people to commit, not realizing that in Australia, the word commit almost exclusively means commit to a mental institution and applies that somehow the person has some cognitive challenges. So she sent over the report. They had a good laugh at their end. They called her up. She was horrified, had to kind of rewrite everything. So I think sometimes it really is good to get your customers involved in that. So this would be an assignment. Rewrite evaluation standards with the people who are going to be impacted by them. I know a library that did something very clever a few years ago, and it was the director, a little sneaky, but she had been fielding vague comments from the uh, community that some of their customer service standards were not quite up to snuff. Sometimes people were indifferent, or they were short, they were rude, they were showing favoritism to family friends at a service desk, that kind of stuff. Nothing terrible. But when she tried to talk to the staff about it, they said, no, no, we're perfect. Everyone loves us. So she said, you know what we need? We need a good set of evaluations of how we're doing. So the staff, and they were delighted to do it, wrote up the evaluations for how they would evaluate customer service in their library. And they created a brochure that got mailed with the gas bill, I think, or the electric bill to every single household in the county, whether or not they were a library card holder. And then they got the feedback. It was the survey. And the feedback was pretty much what the director was hearing from the general public. And the staff couldn't argue with it because they were the ones who wrote the survey. And she said that it was a very at first it was a very disappointing experience. People were angry, defensive, sad, and then they got over that and said, okay, what should we be doing differently? And they had, let's say, more productive talks about what customer service was. But it's the same thing with teen programs. If you have standards for teen behavior, you have a teen council, you let the teens write the standards with adult supervision, and much more likely to have buy-in, much more likely that those standards and parameters, right, the guidelines for behavior will be obeyed. Interview coworkers about what they think are the concepts behind word labels used to describe employee guidelines. So again, some of these things we discussed where it says you should be respectful of each other. What do you think this should mean, right? Can they translate the abstract labels into concrete examples and stories? And what I find interesting is that you'll probably have a certain percentage of people who have wildly different concepts that they're thinking about by which you mean those particular words. And one of the ways they'll express it is, well, Pat, if you really respected me, you just give lip service to respect. But if you really respected me, this is what you would do. And I would tell people that that's a symptom that there's a disconnect between how you think the word is being used versus the other person. So, to quote another one of my mentors, Jan Prince, who's a cognitive psychologist, she said, don't get angry, get interested. Don't get angry at the fact that someone else feels defensive. Get interested in what should we be doing differently about this. And that whole thing of how many of them agree on what those labels mean. One of the staff day exercises I do is I have people sit at a table according to how long they've worked at the library, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 1 year, it depends on the library. And then ask them to talk with each other about what do they wish they had been told when they first worked at the library? What do they wish they had been told? It won't surprise you that people who've been there for a long time said, "Oh, no, everything was fine. I knew from the first day everything I needed to do." The people who were newer said, "Oh, here's some things I wish they had told me." And the people who'd only been there like for a year would say, "Here's our list of everything." Right? And that's part of the thing that happens in acculturation, that after a period of time, weeks, months, years, people usually mostly get on the same page about what those labels mean. But if they are new to the organization, how do we set them up for success? And that's where precision in language comes up with what needs to be done. Now, the two models that are going to be presented as part of the Niche Academy are the influence model and positive reinforcement. They're the modules. These are two different set of modules that are going to be introduced. And what I wanted to do just in preparation for that was to give you kind of a rough overview of what they mean. And then we'll take a quick look at the references and see what questions and comments people might have. So the first thing is influence. And in talking about influence, this is my favorite way of talking about it. This is when we make it as easy as possible for other people to say yes to us, to agree with us, to give us what I want. And that's even when we don't have power and authority. So, how does it mean to be influential? And then the second one is positive reinforcement. And this comes from a model we'll talk about in a minute from the uh, great Karen Pryor, who changed the shape of how we treat animals in circuses and in zoos, but also everyday people with pets. It it's a three-part model, and we pay attention to when people are doing it right. We tell them that they're doing it right, and we reward them for doing it right. Those are sort of the three steps. So let's see what this means if we dig in a little bit. The precision model, and this is again, we're going to be applying the precision model to the influence model. There are three steps. Rapport, which is when we connect with people, and precision is more credible if instead of just saying, "Oh, you're a wonderful person," be able to say, I really admire how you're able to train your cats, Tiffany, and make them productive members of society," right? That's specific rapport building. Information, where it's so important to give people precise information, and this is all we talked about today. And then finally, the action. And for me, the action step is we need to know what the goals are so we can hold ourselves responsible and accountable. So that's what you'll be digging into a little bit with the information on the influence model. Positive reinforcement. We want to pay attention to people when they're doing the right thing. In psychology, we learn that it is absolutely possible to reinforce behavior we don't like by rewarding people for doing that wrong behavior. It's exactly the same thing when we give the
Oh,
puppy attention for being on the couch.
oh,
Then we have what we call tell them. Tell them. And telling them means labeling what they're doing. There's an idea in philosophy that until we name something, it's really hard to talk about it, to agree about it, to walk around and look at it and touch it and so on. So it's that thing when you're walking by a service desk and you see that employee doing a terrific job with a quote difficult customer, and the customer leaves, and that's when you walk up and say, when we were talking about great customer service and I said the tone of your voice is important, what you did with Mr. Smith was perfect. You sounded this way, you talked slowly, you paused, you nodded, waited for him to respond, you had a smile on your face, you didn't sound impatient at all. That's what I'm talking about. And that's oftentimes what people need. And then finally, when you're rewarding them, being able to be specific about what you're rewarding them for and why. So these are some of the things that will be kind of expanded upon in the Niche Academy modules that will be coming up. So here are some of the resources that we put together. Only 3 books. The Tyranny of Metrics is about some of the things that are challenges when you're using numbers to talk about stuff. Why We Buy, famous book's been around for a long time, is about observing behavior. It's all about observing behavior in retail space. My experience, and this gentleman has spoken at the American Library Association conference, national conference, probably 50% of it applies to libraries. And then range, while why generalists triumph in a specialized society, is also about the importance of talking about things rather than just numbers about stuff. Library Research Inc. is that incredible resource that offers training for folks about the importance of keeping track of numbers and metrics. It's the positive side of numbers, and so many free resources for libraries as well. These are resources about specific books and authors that have to do about storytelling and better ways to tell stories. It has a lot of great information about precision and communication. And then here are some tools, tech tools, if you haven't already run into them, about infographics and comics and storyboarding and podcasting, all sorts of ways to combine what we know about storytelling with numbers. So with this, I want to turn things back over to Tiffany and see if we had any questions or comments that came in.
We haven't had any questions.
Mhm.
Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about anything we've covered so far? Please type questions in the chat. We'll give it a minute and see if
Sure.
anyone asks.
Mhm. And a question could also be a comment or a concern. There's something maybe that I spoke on that you strongly disagree with. Those are always useful, I think.
Let's see. Information is giving me a lot to think about. Yes. Um,
Um,
any
mhm.
any other comments,
You know,
thoughts?
one thing I might say, Tiffany, to that is when I was first learning this stuff, I was a little overwhelmed. I have to say, um, I was almost embarrassed how I thought I was such a bad communicator. And it was really good that I live with a Vulcan, my husband Leif, who actually taught this stuff years ago. And again, I first learned it from him and then from other folks because of real world examples. This is why I think that particularly some of the books on this page are really useful because they help combine that idea that I want to be specific, but I don't want to sound like a robot. So that's why I thought these were, and the things like visualization of data is always a good place to start learning about the written form, the visual form of this as well.
Good point. Curtis says, lots of great tips. One thing I was thinking during the session is say what you mean and mean what you say. Yes.
Yes.
And let's
Exactly.
see, a question. What's the best way to have that conversation about expectations around professionalism if it isn't already part of the onboarding process?
Well, I think it just starts with okay, what I was taught that when think of it as a negotiation, what's most important to know is what the other person is thinking and feeling. So it might even start with you saying, I think that we need to start setting some guidelines for what we mean by the word professional and professionalism. And what I'd like to ask you, it could be an individual or the team, could you come up with some ideas? And everybody contribute, right? And there's no right or wrong. We're just trying to get ideas and see if you can, before our next meeting, come up with 10 ideas that you think are professional. And I'm not so much interested in dictionary definitions. Think of a time when you saw someone's behavior and you said that's what it means to be a professional. Or, and when I do something like this at a staff meeting, Tiffany, I'll say, who in the room is someone who you admire and respect who exemplifies this? Like we do this with customer service, for example, and I have yet to have a library that there was almost consensus among the staff, like, oh, this particular person, and they point and we'd embarrass them and they'd laugh and we have them stand up and get a round of applause from everyone. Um, that there was a person, and then it was very interesting interviewing the audience and say, what exactly is it that Tiffany does that you admire and respect that you would call great customer service or professional? So rather than us having the idea, then until we get that, we can't tweak it. We might have a particular thing in mind that is upsetting us, that we don't think is professional. But you're not going to get buy-in until you hear from the other people first. And most of the time, what you're concerned about will come from them. And if it
Mm,
doesn't, that's going to be an interesting cultural thing. Like if you
okay.
say, I think people should be in formal attire, for example.
Yes. More questions, more questions. I realize we are at 3:30 right now, but we do have a few more questions and comments. Um, I tend to write a lot when I'm describing things because I want to give all the information and be utterly unambiguous. Do you have suggestions for how to think about what I'm writing to pare that down?
Yes. What's your top three things?
Top three, yes.
Top
That's a good
three.
point because most people, if you give them a large bulk of information, it's too much. Another question, useful tools to interview our staff about their management personality type. And Curtis suggested the 16personalities.com for personality types. Another question from Jessica. I'm wondering how to support their version of what respect means to them. So once you've gotten those definitions as a group of what respect or professionalism means.
I took what you said seriously, and the next 2 weeks, I've been really working on thinking about that when we're together, not interrupting you. So at the end of the 2 weeks, let's sit down and you get to evaluate me about how well I did that. It's a self assignment. One of my library directors, award winning library directors, says it's when my staff gives me my marching orders.
To follow up, yes, to go forward with what responses they've come up.
Right.
Other questions? Yes, the slides and recording will be emailed. They'll be posted. I will get those out to you. All right, if we don't have other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.